Imagine a weapon a nation kept concealed for 4 decades. And imagine that weapon being cracked open in a single night. That appears to be exactly what happened just outside Isfahan, and the full story behind it is stranger than most people realize. Before we go further, if reporting like this matters to you, take a second now, hit subscribe, drop a like. Now let's dig in. Underneath the mountains south of Isfahan, Iran constructed something the outside world has almost never glimpsed. Not one bunker, not a single storage depot. An entire underground complex carved directly into stone, engineered to shelter missiles, launch infrastructure, and enough firepower to menace an entire region for more than 40 years. Iranian military engineers didn't rush this project. They built it gradually, across generations, adding layer after layer with a single objective in mind. Make it unfindable, make it undestroyable. For a long stretch, that strategy held up. Reconnaissance satellites photographed the mountain repeatedly and captured nothing but bare terrain. Analysts pored over the landscape for months and came away with no solid proof of what sat beneath it. That's the entire logic behind buried weapons infrastructure. It doesn't have to stay hidden permanently. It just has to stay hidden long enough to outlast a war. But wars have a habit of stress testing every plan a nation has ever drawn up, no matter how long that plan took to construct. And over the past 2 years, Iran's underground missile network has faced more pressure than almost any other hardened site on the planet. To understand why this recent moment carries so much weight, rewind to where this chapter truly started. Summer 2025, when American and Israeli forces launched a joint operation against Iran's nuclear and missile infrastructure. That earlier campaign struck locations like Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan, going directly after the underground core of Iran's nuclear program. U.S. officials at the time called the damage severe. Outside assessments were split, with some intelligence estimates describing the setback as genuine but temporary. Iran, meanwhile, maintained that its core capabilities were still largely intact. That disagreement over how much destruction had actually occurred became the root of everything that followed. Because when a country believes it was wounded rather than defeated, it doesn't back down, it rebuilds. And that is apparently exactly what Iran did, particularly around its ballistic missile program. Isfahan was never just another dot on Iran's map. It functions as a central hub for missile manufacturing and storage, one of the most strategically vital locations in the country's entire defense network. Even before this latest round of fighting escalated, Isfahan already carried nuclear weight of its own, with reports describing convoys quietly transporting sensitive material into nearby mountain tunnel systems. So when hostilities between Israel, the United States, and Iran flared up again, it was almost guaranteed that Isfahan would once more become a central flashpoint. What came next wasn't a single strike. It was an entire campaign. Reporting and satellite imagery from this renewed round of conflict described nearly 20 separate bunker-buster strikes against the missile complex on Sophie Mountain, just south of the city. B-2 stealth bombers, B-52s, fighter jets carrying precision-guided penetrator munitions, wave after wave of some of the most advanced air power in existence, all aimed at the same mountainside again and again. And here's the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Despite all of that firepower, Iran reportedly kept firing missiles from that same general area. Sometimes within hours, sometimes within a couple of days of a strike. Locals describe something that sounds almost impossible. Watching bombs rain down on the mountain at night, watching smoke pour out, and then watching missiles rise from those very same slopes not long afterward. Sit with what that actually implies. This wasn't American and Allied forces missing their targets. The strikes were landing, the explosions were genuine, but the underground network had been built with enough redundancy, enough separation between chambers, enough reinforcement that damaging the surface didn't guarantee destroying whatever sat deep below it. That's the entire design philosophy behind what's sometimes called Iran's Missile City doctrine, a strategy resting on the idea that no single strike, and possibly not even 20 strikes, should be able to collapse the whole system at once. This is where the specific munition used in the most recent strike becomes essential to understand. Reports point toward a bunker buster in the 5,000-pound class, a penetrator weapon designed for one job, punch through solid. Rock and reinforced concrete, survive that brutal descent intact, and detonate only once it reaches open space on the far side. Earlier reporting on strikes in the same region has occasionally referenced smaller 2,000-pound weapons instead, so the exact munition used in every single strike isn't fully confirmed. But the category of target is not in dispute. This was an attack aimed directly at Iran's deepest, most heavily protected missile storage. A weapon of this size is typically carried by the F-15E Strike Eagle, an aircraft that offers something bombers like the B-2 can't always match: speed of response. Because these jets are frequently already stationed in the region, a strike package can sometimes be armed and over a target in well under an hour. That matters enormously in a fast-moving conflict, where waiting on a heavier bomber flying in from thousands of miles away can mean the window closes entirely. But speed and firepower only solve half the equation. The other half is knowing precisely where to aim. Here's something that rarely comes up in discussions of bunker-busting campaigns like this one. Iran reportedly didn't build a single entrance into this mountain. Multiple bunker entry points have apparently been carved into the surrounding terrain, deliberately disguised so that from above they all look nearly identical. Some are believed to lead to genuine active storage chambers. Others may exist purely to burn through an adversary's most expensive munitions, luring a strike toward an empty or lightly used space instead of an actual missile stockpile. If that's accurate, and several analysts believe it is part of Iran's defensive playbook, then this entire campaign isn't only a story about explosives, it's a story about intelligence, knowing which tunnel actually leads somewhere, and which one is a trap. A 5,000-pound penetrator bomb isn't cheap, and it isn't limitless. Every strike against this mountain also quietly draws down America's own stockpile of that specific munition. Wasting one on a decoy isn't just a missed opportunity against Iran, it's a real measurable loss from a limited supply that takes real time to replenish. That tension, overwhelming firepower balanced against the risk of being outmaneuvered by clever engineering, is the real story sitting underneath the headlines. And we're only getting started. If you're starting to see just how many layers this conflict actually has, that's exactly why this deserves more attention than it usually gets. Tap that like button if this is opening your eyes even a little, and stay with me, because what comes next might be even harder to believe. So why did this particular strike, out of roughly 20 against the same general zone, suddenly produce something different? Footage that surfaced afterward didn't show a single fireball followed by silence. It showed a mountain that kept detonating minutes after the initial impact had already faded. That detail matters more than almost anything else in this story. A single bomb strike has a distinct signature. One flash, one shockwave, then it's finished. What witnesses near Isfahan described was something else entirely. Secondary blasts, one after another, as though something buried deep inside the mountain kept igniting and detonating on its own, long after the original weapon had completed its job. Military analysts offer a fairly straightforward explanation for that pattern. It's what happens when a stockpile of munitions, actual ballistic missiles and their fuel, gets exposed to fire and starts cooking off internally, chamber by chamber. In other words, this wasn't simply a mountain taking a hit. This was very possibly an active missile depot being torn open from within, its own stored arsenal fueling the destruction. If that assessment holds, it would explain something that has puzzled observers for months. How does a target get struck nearly 20 times and remain functional? The likeliest answer is that most earlier strikes hit outer layers, entrances, access tunnels, surface infrastructure, without ever fully breaching the deepest storage chambers. Iran's engineers built exactly the kind of compartmentalization needed to survive that. Multiple tunnel layers, reinforced blast doors, chambers spaced apart rather than clustered together, so a direct hit on one section wouldn't automatically trigger a chain reaction across the whole facility. That's sophisticated defensive engineering. It also appears to reflect a documented Iranian military doctrine built specifically to survive exactly this kind of war, a strategy sometimes described as missile cities, dozens of hardened underground sites scattered across the country, each engineered with enough internal redundancy that losing one section doesn't mean losing the entire facility. So when a strike finally does seem to reach deep enough to set off a sustained secondary blast, that tells you something significant. Whoever planned this particular attack likely had sharper intelligence than earlier attempts, a clearer map of which tunnel led where and precisely how deep to send the weapon before, triggering detonation. That fuse timing detail deserves its own moment because it's easy to overlook, and it changes everything about whether a strike like this actually succeeds. A bunker buster isn't judged mainly by the size of its blast. It's judged by whether it can survive smashing through layer after layer of rock without breaking apart before reaching its intended target. The casing has to withstand that punishment, and the internal fuse has to be engineered to wait, counting the layers it passes through or timing itself precisely, so detonation happens only once the weapon reaches the actual space it was aimed at. Miss that timing in either direction, and the weapon fails at its one job: detonate too early against the first layer of rock, and you waste the bomb's entire penetrating advantage. Fail to detonate at the correct depth, and the bomb can punch straight through a target without inflicting meaningful damage on whatever's stored inside. The fact that this particular strike produced sustained internal explosions rather than a single blast suggests the fuse landed almost exactly where engineers intended. Now here's where the story gets even more tangled, because military pressure and political negotiation were unfolding at nearly the same moment, and the timing between them raises more questions than it settles. Just one day before footage of this strike began circulating, public signal suggested a deal to end the broader war might be within reach. And then the bunker buster strike happened anyway, hitting one of Iran's most sensitive missile production zones. Within hours of that strike, reports surfaced claiming a follow-up strike package had actually been called off, with word that some form of agreement had been approved at a senior level inside Iran's government and might be signed within days. Iranian officials pushed back on that framing almost immediately, insisting nothing had actually been finalized or signed. That contradiction, a deal reportedly greenlit at the top, while other voices in the same government deny any agreement even exists, isn't an isolated moment in this conflict. It is repeated again and again throughout this war, and it points to something bigger than confusing headlines. It points to a leadership structure inside Iran that looks genuinely fractured, with different factions negotiating, disagreeing, and at times acting without full coordination among themselves. At almost the same moment this diplomatic drama was unfolding, Iran's military made a forceful public statement of its own. Its navy declared the Strait of Hormuz closed to all vessels once again, warning that any ship attempting to pass could become a target. Hours later, 2 Iranian attack drones reportedly moved against a tanker inside the strait. Both drones were intercepted before reaching their target. The tanker completed its journey unharmed. In the days that followed, hundreds of commercial vessels kept moving through protected corridors in the same waterway Iran had just claimed to shut down. Sit with that gap for a second, because it reveals something important about the real balance of power in this moment. Iran's public messaging to its own people described a closed, dangerous strait under its control. The reality on the water told a very different story. One where commercial shipping largely kept moving, protected by active enforcement from opposing naval and air forces. That gap between declared strength and demonstrated reality isn't a minor detail. It might be the clearest window we have into where Iran actually stands right now, a government fighting to project power it may not be able to fully back up with action. We're barely past the midpoint of this story, and there's a lot more worth understanding, especially what this pattern of strikes actually signals about where this war heads next. If you're finding real value in this breakdown, do something simple. Leave one word in the comments describing how this story makes you feel, whether that's stunned, worried, or something else. I read these, and it genuinely shapes what this channel digs into next. Let's talk about why missile stockpiles specifically have become such a central target in this war, because there's a strategic logic underneath all of this that goes well beyond battlefield damage. A country sitting on tens of thousands of ballistic missiles carries enormous leverage. That stockpile threatens neighboring states. It threatens shipping lanes running through critical waterways. In a strange way, it can even function as insurance for a country's broader military ambitions, a deterrent large enough to make outside powers think twice before pushing too hard, regardless of whatever else that country may or may not be building. Strip that stockpile down significantly, and everything shifts at once. Not just the number of missiles a country can physically launch, but its entire negotiating position. Every missile that never gets built because its production facility took a direct hit is a missile that can't threaten a neighbor, can't threaten commercial shipping, and can't be used as a bargaining chip down the line. That's very likely the real reason missile production and storage, sites, rather than just launch pads or communication systems, have become such a consistent focus as this war has dragged on. Destroying stored weapons and the facilities that build them doesn't just win a single engagement, it strips away leverage a country would otherwise carry into every negotiation that follows, this one included. Look at how the broader bombing campaign around Isfahan unfolded. Over time, because the sequence itself tells a story. Early phases of this renewed conflict focused heavily on radar systems and communication infrastructure, essentially blinding and silencing Iran's ability to detect incoming threats and coordinate a response. The next phase shifted toward command and control systems, the connective tissue linking Iran's military leadership to forces in the field. Only after those systems had been degraded did strikes pivot more heavily toward ballistic missile production and storage itself. That progression looks a lot like a deliberate strategy, methodically stripping away a country's ability to see, communicate, and coordinate before going after the actual weapon stockpile. Whether that sequencing was planned from the outset or simply evolved as each phase revealed what Iran had left, the effect ends up the same. Either way, each stage of this campaign made the next stage more effective by removing exactly the systems Iran would otherwise use to detect an incoming strike, warn its own forces, or recover quickly once damage was done. There's also a genuinely difficult strategic gamble buried inside Iran's response to all of this. Rather than simply absorbing the losses, Iranian engineers have reportedly kept expanding and rebuilding underground storage capacity even while active bombing continued, essentially betting that new construction could outpace the rate of destruction. That's an extraordinarily hard wager to sustain, building faster than an opponent with a repeatedly demonstrated ability to locate and strike hardened underground targets can tear apart what's already been built. It reflects real defiance. It also reflects something closer to desperation, a government trying to preserve one of its last major sources of leverage, even as the physical infrastructure supporting that leverage keeps getting broken open, strike after strike, month after month. None of this happens in isolation from the diplomatic track either. This exact pattern, a strike followed almost immediately by reports of a near-finished deal, followed by public denial from inside the very government that supposedly approved it, has repeated often enough throughout this conflict that it's become something close to a recognizable rhythm. Maybe that reflects genuine last-minute negotiating breakthroughs colliding with internal political resistance inside Iran. Maybe it reflects something more calculated, a stalling tactic dressed up as a near agreement to buy time for further rebuilding. From the outside, it's genuinely difficult to know for certain which explanation is closer to the truth. But the practical effect stays the same either way. Ongoing uncertainty about whether military pressure against sites like this one is about to wind down or about to intensify further, depending almost entirely on decisions being made inside a government that doesn't appear fully unified on what it actually wants. So where does that leave things right now? Iran appears to want financial support to rebuild what's been destroyed, wants to keep the true size of its remaining missile stockpile out of any written agreement, and wants to preserve as much leverage as possible heading into whatever final negotiation eventually happens. The opposing side keeps demonstrating, strike after strike, that even Iran's most deeply buried, most carefully engineered infrastructure isn't beyond reach, hitting it again whenever the diplomatic track shows signs of stalling. Both sides appear to be negotiating and fighting at the exact same time, an uncomfortable but increasingly familiar pattern in how this conflict is played out. There's one more layer worth understanding before we get to how this story actually ends. It might be the most important one of all, because it isn't really about bombs or tunnels. It's about what happens to a country's entire sense of security once a core piece of its military deterrence starts visibly cracking under sustained pressure. Ballistic missiles aren't just weapons. A country points at its enemies during active fighting. For a nation like Iran, that stockpile functions as long-term insurance, a deterrent that makes any outside power think twice before pushing too aggressively, precisely because Iran has demonstrated both the willingness and the raw numbers needed to make retaliation genuinely costly. Every strike that meaningfully reduces that stockpile or slows down how quickly it can be rebuilt chips away at that deterrent value in a way that compounds over time rather than resetting after each individual attack. A country holding 10 or 15,000 ballistic missiles can absorb the loss of a few hundred in a failed strike and still project real strength to the rest of the world. But a country whose production base keeps taking damage faster than it can realistically rebuild eventually reaches a very different kind of moment, one where every remaining missile becomes far too valuable to risk on anything but the most critical possible target. Whether Iran has actually reached that turning point hasn't been confirmed publicly, but the sustained pace of strikes against exactly this kind of production infrastructure strongly suggests that American and allied military planners believe pushing Iran toward that point is both achievable and worth the very real cost of expending some of the most advanced, expensive precision weapons in the world to get there. This might be the clearest explanation for why a lasting deal remains so difficult to finalize, even in moments when both sides appear to signal they're close. Iran's entire negotiating position depends heavily on the leverage its missile stockpile provides, both as protection against further strikes and as something valuable enough to eventually trade away for sanctions relief or reconstruction support. Agreeing to specific, verifiable limits on that stockpile, the kind of concrete limits any credible written agreement would almost certainly require, means voluntarily surrendering the one piece of leverage that actually worries its opponents most. That's an extraordinarily difficult decision for any government to make. It becomes even harder for a government as visibly divided internally as Iran currently appears to be, where different factions may hold very different views on whether that trade is even worth making at all. We're almost at the end of the story, and what comes next deserves your full attention because how this plays out could shape the region for years. Before we get there, if this video has taught you something you didn't know 5 minutes ago, that's genuinely the entire reason this channel exists. Share it with someone who still thinks this war is only about nuclear facilities, because the missile side of this story rarely gets the attention it deserves. Here's where everything comes together. This strike outside Isfahan wasn't just another entry on a long list of bombing runs against the same general area. It was a rare moment where the underground defenses Iran spent 40 years perfecting appeared to genuinely fail, at least in one specific location, at least for one specific night. A mountain built to hide missiles from the entire world instead lit up from the inside and kept exploding for minutes after the weapon that started it all was already gone. That image alone tells you almost everything you need to know about where this conflict actually stands. Not a war that's close to over, and not a war that's nowhere near resolution either. Something in between, messier and far more uncertain than either side's public statements would have you believe. A government in Iran that says one thing to its own people and appears to mean something else internally. A military campaign that keeps landing real, measurable blows against targets built specifically to survive them, and a diplomatic track that keeps almost reaching the finish line, only to pull back at the very last moment again and again. What happens after this depends on questions nobody outside a small handful of decision makers can answer with any real certainty. Does Iran's leadership actually reach internal agreement on the deal reportedly approved at the top? Or do the fractures inside that same leadership structure derail? Hit the way earlier frameworks have collapsed before? Does the military pressure campaign against sites like this one keep building towards some kind of breaking point? Or does a genuine ceasefire finally take hold before that point is ever reached? What we do know is this: a mountain that took 4 decades to build layer by layer, specifically to remain hidden and untouchable, was cracked open in a single night. And whatever comes next in this war, that single fact won't be easy for either side to forget. If this story kept you here until the very end, that tells me something worth knowing. Stay subscribed, because stories like this one are only going to keep unfolding, and you deserve to understand them clearly without the noise. Thank you for watching all the way.